The president sees the vice president as an important partner and somebody who can work to take on challenging and hard initiatives. That's the role of the modern day vice president. And she actually asked to run point and lead on voting rights. It's an issue that she is personally committed to and passionate about. As she conveyed in her statement yesterday, she expects in the weeks ahead to engage not just with the American people, but with voting rights organizations, community organizations, the private sector to help strengthen and uplift efforts on voting rights nationwide. That includes working with members of Congress, certainly to move legislation forward, something the president strongly supports. It also includes working with local organizations, working with states to see how to make voting more accessible to people across the country. So I think the president is looking to work with the vice president as a partner and looking forward to her taking on this important initiative, something that's a priority to him as well. And I'm sure he'll be regularly updated on her progress. He believes that the Texas legislation is a part of a concerted attack on our democracy being advanced, as we have seen, not just in Texas, as you well know, but in states across the country on the basis of the same repeatedly disproven lies that led to the assault on our nation's capital on January 6th. So that is, of course, of great concern to the president. He thinks that must stop. It must be easier, not harder, for all eligible voters to vote, to register and cast their ballots. We need to move forward and not backward. And the fact that the Texas legislation would make it harder to vote in a state where it is already too hard for many people to vote, but it's not the only state where we're seeing this troubling trend. But this is one of the reasons why he asked his she asked for it, but he certainly was thrilled to have her leading the effort on voting rights moving forward, given this is a huge priority to him and a huge priority to her as well.
Another promise of Joe Biden that seems like it's going to go into the toilet bin of failed promises. What she's talking about here is that Kamala Harris is going to take on the mantle of trying to get voting rights passed. So the House passed For the People Act. Now, For the People Act was a voting rights. It's an overhaul of the voting legislation in the United States. And it passed it nearly party line, 210 to 220, 220 to 210. What she said there is right. So I've done multiple points. I've even written articles on Republicans' effort at undermining voting. You must understand, from a standpoint of dogma, Republicans win when you have less people voting. When you have more people voting and you extend the number of people who can vote, you tend to get more Democratic victories. It's the reason why voting rights legislation or the interstate cross-check or trying to get rid of souls to the polls and all of these other things. Because Republicans see these things as being detrimental to their capability of winning the race. So you have this interesting scenario here where Jen Psaki is basically saying we're giving this over to Kamala Harris to pass. It's already passed the House. Biden said he's for it. Problem. Republicans on one side, Democrats on the other. Now think about what we're saying for the moment. Right here, Republican lawmakers have enacted voting restrictions in a total of 11 states: Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Idaho, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, Kentucky, Montana, Utah, and Wyoming. Republican state legislatures have introduced bills that will make it harder to vote. Based on the latest data, 404 voting restrictions bills have been introduced in 48 state legislatures, 90% of which entirely supported by Republicans. Think of what I'm saying for the moment. Even if, let's put this aside, let's go to DC. Democrats and people who are in DC have on their license plates taxation without representation. Now, what they're saying and the point that they're making here is, hey, you need to include us as a state. So you have a lot of people who are pushing for this notion of making Washington, D.C. a state, with the idea that the people who are here can vote and tally into regards to the presidential elections. Now, Democrats are for this. Republicans are against this. Now, Democrats are for this for the obvious reason that D.C. is going to vote entirely, basically, Democrat. It is just going to be a Democratic stronghold. Republicans are against it for the exact same reason. Now, it doesn't matter that it's going to be a Democratic stronghold. Those people should have the right to vote. It doesn't matter that it cuts against Republican interests. That is less relevant than the issue of democracy itself and the capabilities of people to be able to express themselves through the ballot box. The voting thing is the same. You should have each and every American should be eligible to vote. Each and every American that goes to the polls and put their finger and press that button should be tallied and registered. Whether it's a Republican, Democrat, or somewhere in between, or somewhere on the outskirts, that vote should be registered, even if that vote is written in. I don't care if that adversely affects Republicans. That is an issue of democracy, and that's an issue of being in a republic. If Republicans are that unpopular in regards to policy positions, then they need to change their policy positions. It's not an issue of the American public at that point. It's an issue of America itself and the democratic process and the capabilities of individuals to go and express themselves in the voting booths. And right now, I'm taking out the issue of protests and everything else, and I'm talking explicitly in the context of elections. So you have Democrats who say, okay, if Republicans are going to be attacking the voting process, if they're going to be doing this in all of these various states, that is going to be making it that much more difficult for us to get elected, then we need to do something about the voting issue. The Supreme Court gut the Voting Rights Act, and the moment that the Voting Rights Act was gutted, you had all of these states to start enacting policies that would make it that much more difficult for minorities to vote. Or at the very least make it more difficult in comparison to other groups that would typically vote Republican. This is North Carolina's 12th district. Now, just for context, that green area, is what a typical district looks like. This is North Carolina's 12th district. North Carolina's 12th district looks like this because it allows the individual that's running in that area to get elected, meaning it is hard to dislodge that person because the district is shaped and fashioned in a way to get his voters while excluding others. That is the exact reason that this is not a nice little shaded circle, and this is this weird looking shape. It entrenches that person in office. It's not just North Carolina. This is Maryland's 3rd district, Florida's 5th district, Pennsylvania's 7th district. I hope you get my point. This takes place all across the United States where people wedge themselves into those offices, making it difficult to dislodge those people from those offices because of the way that they gerrymander the districts, meaning fashioning the districts to basically get their voters and exclude other voters. This is, again, another issue of voter suppression in a way where a person wedged themselves in an office, and something that is, again, a subversion of democracy and a way for a person to basically stay elected despite the fact that the person is not necessarily the most popular. It's not just gerrymandering. Look at the money that is dumped into politics. You get billions of dollars in dark money. You get billions of dollars in soft money. You get billions of dollars in hard or overt cash that is going to particular candidates. You even get money in the context of behind the scenes, with 70% of the time that the politician spent is dialing for dollars. So the majority, overwhelmingly so, of the time that politicians are engaged in their activities, that activity is basically, we need to get cash. Gerrymander districts, cash being the mover and shaker within the context of the political space. And keep in mind, the cash is not there to try to get people to vote in the interests of things that are in their best interests. The cash is there to get people to vote in things that is not in their interests, to get the public to support a position that is not within the public's interests. That's the entire point of the cash in the politics. And yet there are billions that are dropped for that explicit interest of giving the public to vote and do things that are against their best ideals. Whether you want to say the pot legislation in California, I think this was like a decade ago, whether you want to talk about Medicare for all today, or whether you want to talk about voting rights. Because the voting rights legislation is something that companies are not for. They're not for it because they realize that it undermines their capabilities of influencing the electoral space, which is kind of the entire point of the electoral laws. In part, anyway. Part of it is to rebuff Republicans' goals of making it more difficult for Democrats to get in office. The other part is to undermine the influence of money in the political space. Because of such, companies are not necessarily for it. and they are putting money in people's pockets in order for them to undermine and subvert this legislation, just like I mentioned beforehand with the billions of dollars in dark money, hard money, and soft money. You even have things like electoral purges, where they would kick people out the voting rolls, things where they would eliminate or undermine early voting. These are things, even lines. Somebody having to wait in a 5, 6, 7 hour line. Hell, you even had 10-hour lines. What does that do to an individual? How many people will stand there for 7 hours to vote? And the longer that an individual has to stand there to vote, the more difficult it makes it for that individual to vote. And you would have these being in very specific areas that are against the interests of the ruling voting bloc. When that was Sanders running against Clinton, it was the purges against Sanders. It was the changing of the voting locations against Sanders. Those are things that Democrats was doing to undermine the capability of Sanders to win. I'm saying that we should not have a political and electoral process that can be screwed around with and undermined at a whim based on what political actors need or want or what is politically expedient in the moment. And right now, in these various states, what's politically expedient is not changing policies that make them more appetizing to the public, but instead to just make it that much more difficult to vote, to make it that much more easier for a particular candidate to get in office. If you're a Democrat, and you know this, good sense would say we need to protect ourselves. We need to defend ourselves. Bipartisanship, and just for the sake of bipartisanship, is utterly and radically stupid. Radically stupid. The objective is not bipartisanship for the sake of bipartisanship. If you are pushing policies that the overwhelming majority of the public will back and that the public would support, then you will break your opposition, and that opposition will come and acquiesce to your will. Even if they don't necessarily give in entirely, they will definitely give in on some level. Now, Joe Manchin, Democrat, has come out and basically said, I'm not for this voting rights stuff. I'm not going to get involved in an overhaul of the voting process. Republicans, of course, are like, yeah, we're not going to touch the voting process because we need the voting process to stay exactly the way it is to allow our states to give us a better chance of staying in office. Joe Manchin is basically kneecapping Biden's presidency. Fact of the matter is, I don't necessarily think Biden have the power and energy in him to extemporaneously get on a stage using the bully pulpit to excoriate his opposition, be it within his party or without his party. I don't even know if he full well believes in the things that he's saying. I'm inclined to say I don't think he believes it at all. But on the voting rights thing, from the standpoint of being a Democrat and from the standpoint of being in the Democratic Party, the idea that you would not be able to get your people online for policies that protect your capabilities of getting elected, and not just your capabilities of getting elected, the capability of an American to make a vote and have that vote count and to know that that vote count and to know that the electoral process is legit, to add transparency into the electoral system, to eliminate or at the very least undermine the role that money plays in our electoral system. And yeah, if you're an American, you should be able to vote. Joe Manchin, once again, is repudiating his own party and is basically saying, I'm not going to do it. Today, face the nation. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to overhaul that process. I'm not going to touch that process. This is astonishing. Joe Biden, by not castigating Manchin early on, has basically allowed Manchin to be the deciding person on whether or not legislation is going to pass, even when that legislation is in the best interests of the Democratic Party itself. Biden should be ashamed of himself. It is utterly embarrassing that Biden is in that role, and yet Joe Manchin is the one who basically comes out every other week saying, yeah, I'm not for that. I'm not going to vote for that. I'm not going to allow the party to push that. This is dead on arrival, etc., etc., etc. I am unclear at which point Joe Manchin was elected to be president of the United States. And yet, puff of smoke, Joe Biden, wisp of his former self, has no capability to push back, no capability to stand out there and attack his party, to go after members that are stopping and blocking his agenda. Joe Manchin is going to end Joe Biden's presidency. Joe Manchin going this route is going to have Republicans take either the House or take the Senate, at which point Joe Biden's presidency will be effectively over. Don't blame Republicans for this. All Democrats They're negotiating with themselves and negotiating themselves down under this nonsense proposal, this false religiosity of bipartisanship. I'll end here. It's annoying. That's all. It's like, just in basic raw partisanship, one party is trying to undermine the capability of the other party to get elected. That party has been doing this for decades, by the way. The party that has power now to try to do something about that, instead of doing something about that, decides to negotiate itself down and to stand and watch as their lives are made that much more difficult in those various states, making it that much more difficult for them to get elected. What idiots you are. What idiots. Like, share,